Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be part of a ruthless crime organization? During the 1980s, Philadelphians were confronted with these individuals every day. The Italian mob, commonly known as the Mafia, was the reason behind most of the news stories citizens would hear about. These mob wars were caused by mobster families fighting to gain control of all the crime profits. During the late 19th and early 20th century, many Italians came to America seeking work. In the 1920s, when the United States banned alcohol, Italian-American mobs began illegally manufacturing and selling alcohol. Meanwhile, overseas, the Sicilian Mafia in Italy was in trouble because of Benito Mussolini's fascist ruling. Many of the Sicilian gang members escaped to America and inevitably got involved in the bootlegging of alcohol. A few years later, a struggle for mob power broke out in New York. It was known as the Castellammarese War. Salvatore Maranzano won and named himself Capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. During this time, the Mafia was separated into 5 main families that spread to different cities in the United States. One of those cities was Philadelphia. Thus, the Philadelphia mob was born. There were quite a few big-name mobsters in Philadelphia, with a fair share of nicknames. Each had their own opinions on how the mob should be ran, as discussed earlier, this often resulted in rough tides. One of these men was Angelo Bruno. His views eventually resulted in his demise. Angelo Bruno was born in Sicily in 1911 and settled in Philadelphia during the 1920s. He soon began taking part in criminal activity. When he first started, the Philadelphia Mafia boss was Salvatore Sabella. Sabella had been committing crimes since 1911. Eventually he was caught and deported. John Avina became the new boss. Eventually his family retired, and Antonio Polino became the new boss. There had been another candidate for his position, though. Angelo Bruno was also a top candidate. After becoming boss, Polino still didn't feel at ease with a potential candidate who could take his place. He decided it would be best to have Bruno hit. When Angelo Bruno heard this news, he met with his old friend, Carlo Gambino. Gambino had become one of the most powerful bosses in the United States. He made it clear that Bruno wouldn't be hit, but instead would become the new mob boss of Philadelphia. When Gambino asked Bruno what he wanted to do with Polina, he said to keep him alive. This way the mob could get used to their new leader and not hate him for killing their old one. The plan worked. This is a perfect example of why Angelo Bruno was often called the gentle Don or the docile Don. He believed in handling his business quietly and not overreacting. By working in such a professional manner, it enabled him to become the most successful boss in Philadelphia. Drug trafficking was big in the Mafia when Bruno became boss. He opposed it, which led to him banning the dealing of drugs. This angered the mobsters who believed they were losing money by not taking part in the crime. Later, in 1977, the Gambling Act in New Jersey was changed, enabling more money for Philadelphia mobsters, but Bruno declared Atlantic City open territory. This meant that other mafia families could operate criminal business there. He believed this was the only way to stop a war from starting between the families. Once again, the Philadelphia mobsters believed they were losing too much money and decided it was time to do something about it. On March 21st, 1980, Bruno was in his car with bodyguard John Stanfa. A man fired a shotgun and killed Bruno, and in the process wounded Stanfa. Anthony Tony Bananas Carpenegro was the main man behind his murder. He was later set up and killed. The death of the docile Don ended the peace. The next big-name boss would give the Philadelphia Mafia the name the most dysfunctional mafia family in the United States. Before the reign of dysfunctional terror that ensued a year after Bruno's death, his underboss, Philip Chicken Man Testa, became boss. He couldn't do much for the mob, though, because his murder happened a year after his leadership began. Testa was born in Sicily and moved to New York. He befriended Bruno and was soon introduced into the Mafia. He gained 2 nicknames during this time. One was the Julius Caesar of the Philadelphian mob, because of his gambling. The other was Chicken Man. This was due to his pockmarked or covered with pitted scars face. At the age of 32, he had his one and only son, Salvatore Testa. On March 15, 1981, Testa returned to his home in Girard Estates. As he opened his front door, a nail bomb exploded under his porch. Testa was rushed to St. Agnes Medical Center, but died because of internal bleeding. Salvatore, Testa's son, decided to find the man who killed his father. 1 year later, he found Rocco Marinucci and killed him. Marinucci, along with Frank Narducci Sr., had waited outside the home and detonated the bomb. Salvatore then killed Narducci. In a song written by Bruce Springsteen, titled Atlantic City, he mentions the Chicken Man. The song is about the Mafia and some of the crimes they committed. He uses Testa's story as an example to something the Mafia did. Here's the segment from the song.
They blew up a chicken man in Philly last night. Now they blew up his house too. Down on the boardwalk they're getting ready for a fight. Gonna see what them racket boys can do.
After Testa's death, we see the dysfunction in Philadelphia's Mafia begin. In Brooklyn, New York, in 1929, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo was born. His parents had ties with the mob. In 1963, Scarfo reportedly stabbed and killed a man during a fight in a Philadelphian restaurant. Scarfo eventually pled guilty to manslaughter, and in 1964, after only serving less than a year in prison, he was released. After his release, Angelo Bruno sent Scarfo to Atlantic City to handle some criminal business. While struggling financially, Scarfo began a loan sharking business, and was later asked to testify before the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation. He was given a year in prison and served his time alongside with Bruno. A few years later, in 1976, Scarfo began working on the construction of casinos. During this time, a man named Vincent Falcone said disrespectful remarks about Scarfo. He didn't take lightly to the situation, and on December 16, 1979, Scarfo and his associates shot and killed Falcone. They were arrested but later were found not guilty. After Testa's death, Scarfo took over in Philadelphia. He was very different from Bruno's easygoing manner. One of his first orders was to have members of the Riccobini family killed. He later had Philip Testa's son, Salvatore Testa, killed. Scarfo's work did bring in a lot of money, though. Between 1982 to 1986, he brought in an estimated $5 to $7 million. Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramundi was a mob associate who later began to help the FBI. He testified against the Philadelphia mob, which resulted in another 14 years in prison for Scarfo. While in prison, he was found guilty for the first-degree murder of Frankie Flowers d'Alfonso, and given life sentences. He recently died in prison on January 13, 2017, at the age of 87. Before his death, it was soon realized that Scarfo would not be able to run the Mafia from prison. John Stanfa, Bruno's bodyguard, took over for him and was viewed as a good candidate to older mobsters because he was born in Sicily. The younger members, on the other hand, didn't like him. The younger generation decided to run their own crime family and were led by Joseph Skinny Joey Merlino. It was in prison that Merlino first decided to take control of the Philadelphia Mafia. He wanted to start a war for control of the crime family. Aware of the divide, Stanford tried to make peace by making Joseph Cingolini Jr., a friend of Merlino, his new underboss. His plan didn't work. By 1992, tensions rose and another war was on its way. Some of Merlino's men killed Testa's underboss, Joseph Cingolini Jr. Attacks continued for months, and Merlino almost lost his life many times. Testa's army was larger, but Merlino had a lot of allies with other criminal organizations in Philadelphia. From 1994 to 1995, Stanfa and many of his supporters were arrested. Merlino and colleague Ralph Natali took over the crime family. Natali became the boss and Merlino the underboss. This wasn't the end to the Philadelphia Mafia War. Merlino was put in and out of control, many others were killed, other crimes were committed, and even more men were arrested. Merlino is still alive to this day. The crimes have died down a lot since the 80s, but the Mafia is still around. Maybe one day they will rise again and we'll all be living the reality our parents had faced.